the main form of racism, white racism, is the one-way institutionalized mistreatment. I'll say that again. The one-way institutionalized mistreatment of Africans, indigenous people, Asians, Latin Americans, Arabs, and others, and their descendants, people of color. Right. This system, which entails unequal access to resources of society, is supported by violence, threats of violence, misinformation, lies, isolation, and greed. Is directed at people targeted by racism and carried out by white people.
Who are you quoting?
This is a, I'll get into it later.
It's a journal.
Yeah. It's some, where we're getting, well, we'll get to it, okay?
I mean, that you spoke about, you're talking from one particular perspective. This person sounds like they're making a very racist idea of what racism is, because they're talking only about white people against people who are like not white.
Well, that's why we're only talking about.
But this person sounds.
Well, that's what we said.
I know what I'm saying, but I'm saying this. You asked to define racism. You're not talking about that racism.
Talking about a particular strain of racism, particular trend in racism.
Right, it's how some people would define racism, but that's not an absolute definition, because there are people who would argue with that. And the point is, the people who would argue with that, some of them might be in this room, and they don't want to take over your conversation, but you have to understand that
The
what you
purpose
said
of this
already.
lecture of racism is this definition.
Is their definition, exactly.
Right.
But people are just making their comment without.
There's lots to be said.
There is a concept that can be filled by this definition. If you want to call it racism, if you want to say that that's the general what racism is, fine. If you need another word for it.
There's lots to be said.
What's the difference between somebody being racist?
Historically, racism is perpetuated by white people.
No, it's not.
No.
There are a lot of
No,
dark
not at
people
all.
who persecute people who are darker than them, all over the place.
Right.
Or lighter.
That's true too.
That's true too. I mean, there
Racist
is.
against another color, and a Jew that's racist against, you know, you make a prejudgment on a Jew and you're nasty to another Jew.
Right. Okay, so let me back up for a sec.
It's not race.
Well, however we'll get to the finer points of defining what racism is, what it ends up, the reason that we carry it out on whatever level is because of, what was I gonna say? I lost my train of thought, sorry.
Group identity?
Inferiority?
Yeah.
Can I jump in here a second, possibly? And then maybe that the racism that you're speaking about is that racism which the general has the capacity to affect. In other words, if there is racism of African Americans against, so to speak, whites or Jews, whatever, it's pretty much ineffectual. It doesn't have much of a ramification, at least in general society as a whole.
Very well.
I'm sorry? Whereas,
Based on Crown Heights.
whereas the racism that...
Yeah, it's a good
So
point.
we're not talking about an attitude,
This
we're
guy
not talking
lived
about the
with
stance
it.
that people take. We're
Basically,
talking about the stance that
us who
people
grew up
take.
in the ghetto,
And what
we
makes
got
it
some
legitimate
opinions
is
on the
that
subject matter.
it's
but we'll just-
effectual.
we'll just-
Well, that is
And if somebody else would have just as a terrible perspective, or not, you didn't even say a value judgment, but
Okay.
just the same kind of perspective, but didn't have the power, we wouldn't call it racism.
No, we call
Okay.
racism, but not for this
So,
particular...
hold on a second, yeah, okay, so I don't wanna get caught up in
I know.
that. And I know that where a lot of people go with this is like reverse racism, as they say, like when, people of color are, you know, will beat up a white person or something,
Or are
and it's
racist
color
against
based.
themselves. There's so
Right,
many
right.
different permutations. of
Sure,
what
sure.
Or if the
So let's-
population shifts in general, where you had a population majority in one way, and then it changes
Right.
over
Right, that would
areas
also
of the
be interesting.
population.
Why don't you start with an example of, like, that gets to the point of what you're...
One second, there's a really important point actually that we just realized that we kind of skipped over.
The discussion, so let's, well, we can go in all those different directions, but for now, just keeping it for white people, and in particular, the institutionalized racism, like Isaac said, you know, those would be more isolated incidents. This is like on an institutional level, what racism is more is white people people of color. So, but what I wanted to say, and is sort of the basis, this is sort of the basis for our whole discussion, is that however we define it, however we have witnessed it, the only way that we ever would participate in this is as a result of us having been hurt in some way, put down, ignored, threatened, scared, criticized, isolated, etc. And and so what happens is that when we're vulnerable in those positions, when we've been hurt, this is when we develop confusion about people around us, and we come to accept some of these messages about other people, and we end up, how I was saying before, that white people end up being hurt by this, and ourselves, that we end up being hurt by this, is because what ends up is that we end up scared of other people, and yay, we end up scared of other people and distrustful of other people, and in particular because that's something in particular to Jews, that as Jews we've been so mistreated ourselves. We often carry a lot of distrust of people, and that gets exacerbated when we are separated from other races of people. Then that distrust is exacerbated, and that keeps us from other people even more. So the whole thing sort of self-perpetuates. So what we want,
and for those reasons that you just mentioned, kind of, unfortunately, that's what keeps us apart from each other. Not just white people against people of color, but even to each other. So we have these mistrust patterns, and those feelings of being isolated and threatened and ignored kind of get in between us, just as people, just as human beings, and so we lose.
That would have to be something
Well, I would say,
special, though.
For instance, when you see another white person saying something racist, saying something offensive, I'm totally guilty of this. My first instinct is to separate myself from that person. Like, I don't want to be associated with that person. Instead of remembering that this person is just as much of a product of society, of a racist society, and how their way of, how racism comes out on them is really no worse than how it comes out for me. So we could talk about some examples of racism, what we're talking about. Do you want to?
Let's talk a little bit on this.
Okay. So we kind of have been saying a lot about the ways that racism gets that sort of racism kind of creeps up on us, that we're not even conscious of it sometimes, and often the reason that it perpetuates and that we don't end up getting to sort of think clearly about it and not be a victim to that is because we're afraid of talking about it, or afraid of admitting to things, or we don't have room in society to talk about it.
Right.
And so what we wanted to introduce,
our voices kind of stay quiet, even that situation that you mentioned about you seeing another white person do something racist, and it's hard for you to not want to even associate with them, to even have your voice in that would be something so powerful.
I mean, to stand up against something that somebody said, or to interrupt somebody being racist, for instance. Those are really scary things to do. I mean, it takes an incredible amount of bravery and confidence to do something like that. So often we don't do. often don't, yeah.
I don't think everybody's racist, I mean, excuse me, but I was brought up,
With the definitions in hand,
I was
that's
exposed,
produced.
I think exposure and your experiences with these people.
Right.
Now, if you were brought up with a nanny that was, you know, of that echelon.
Well, you think everybody's
and
racist?
something like that.
I would have to disagree. I think that everybody, when their children are sexist and racist,
Black people are
all those
It's
kind of
parents,
things,
it's all
because
about
that's
their
just the
parents.
idiot, that's the way you process things, and think that happened afterwards, happened afterwards.
Black